First, the tensions in Ukraine, of course, dominating a lot of headlines around the world.
That's right. There's a photo of those scuffles that broke out in Parliament yesterday. That's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today. Those scuffles between communist lawmakers who supported the ousted president, Viktor Yanukovych, and lawmakers from the far-right Nationalist Party. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, all this comes as Ukraine is trying to make moves to assert control. Yesterday, we saw that Ukrainian police regained the control of a government building in Donetsk that had been occupied by pro-Russian protesters.
And there are warnings in the press, Flo, that history could be repeating itself.
That's right. That's what a lot of papers are saying today. Let's take a look at the editorial in the Wall Street Journal that says that Vladimir Putin is back on the offensive. Russia is following the Crimea script in eastern Ukraine. And this time, Washington and Europeans shouldn't claim to be surprised. It's very critical of the international response so far to Russia. The threat of sanctions being brandished by the U.S. and Europe is nothing more than a meaningless red line, says the Wall Street Journal today. The International New York Times also talks about a familiar script in Ukraine, and it says that the Western response, the next Western response, must be ready and credible. The U.S. and Europe must prepare extensive and strong sanctions and agree to impose them immediately, and these sanctions should include restricting the access of Russian banks and corporations to Western financial markets, according to the International New York Times.
Now we move on to Indonesia, where voting has begun, Flo, in voting for elected representatives in both the national and local parliaments.
That's right. Let's take a look at the front page of the Jakarta Post. You can see a photo there of ballot boxes being loaded in Jakarta and calls there mounting for fair elections. In its editorial, the Jakarta Post says the day has finally come when Indonesians make their choice. Some 19,000 seats are being contested across the nation. And this editorial calls on the men and women that are staffing the polling stations. Well, it calls them actually the vanguards of democracy and calls on them to set their differences aside and work shoulder to shoulder to make sure these elections are indeed fair. And a lot of other papers are focusing on these elections. I pulled out an article from The Australian that points out that Indonesia is part of the so-called Fragile Five. That includes also Brazil, India, South Africa, and Turkey. And actually, all of these nations are holding national elections this year. And this article says that these elections in Indonesia are an opportunity for Indonesia to distance itself from what it calls an odious comparison to the other countries, because Indonesia is not as fragile as these other fragile five. Financial and diplomatic circles, for instance, say they're very optimistic about the future in Indonesia, more so than in India, actually, where elections also kicked off this week. A lot of papers are calling it the biggest election in history. Over 800 million people are registered to vote in India. And I pulled out a cartoon from the International New York Times by Shapat, where you can see people there voting. One elected official there, he's counting 615 million, and the other guy saying, almost there, 200 million to go.
It is a logistical feat. We're going to stay in the region for a moment, Flo. You've pulled out a piece from The Guardian about a curious case that's put the Pakistani criminal justice system under the spotlight.
That's right. The Pakistani police is drawing quite a lot of criticism because, it's charged a 9-month-old boy with attempted murder. And you can actually see a photo there of the baby, Musa Khan. He's crying as his fingerprints are being taken in Lahore. He was booked for supposedly taking part in a riot in one of the city's slums, and he had to be comforted with a milk bottle. Now, this article in The Guardian points out that media in Pakistan have highlighted the absurdity of this situation. This episode has really shed a bad light on the criminal justice system. This article says that police are underpaid and ill-trained and often resort to collective punishment of entire families. And this article points out, though, that an official inquiry has been ordered and one of the police officers has been suspended.
Extraordinary. Thank you very much indeed, Flo. A look at Pakistan's criminal justice system and indeed the rest of the day's headlines in the international press. Thank you very much. 27 minutes past 9. We're going to take a quick break. And in just a moment, the headlines.
Kigali Revisited. 20 years after the genocide, Rwanda's capital city is a monument to modernity. All districts of Kigali have been renovated and its roads repaved, though sometimes at the expense of the most deprived. The memory of the genocide can never be erased, but Rwandans are moving on. Mixed marriages between Hutus and Tutsis are happening again. Kigali Revisited on France 24 and on France24.com.